Okay, to conclude this week's lecture on digital sociology, I thought I would come back to some sociological conceptual ideas that are helpful for thinking about the changes that I've been talking about throughout, and particularly around the idea that capitalism itself, as I mentioned in the first part of the lecture, has now fundamentally changed because of the way that these new ICTs, digital technologies, affect production processes, consumption processes, work processes, leisure, all this kind of stuff, and how it blurs the lines between these things. So there's a lot of work that goes around thinking about these new things, much of it arguing that we need to kind of conceive of capitalism beyond just this kind of market of goods and services exchange, and that the data information now become, key products and key things to consume and key things that become ways of, disciplining us in that Foucauldian sense. So for Cernick, he argues that capitalism is structured by what he calls platforms, and these are very familiar, huge multinational corporations: Apple, Google, Amazon, Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, all these kind of names that most people are familiar with. And previous versions of capitalism, the new developments tend towards narrowing monopolies. That a few companies are kind of fighting over these spaces, controlling them. Importantly, what this means, though, that they manipulate our attention and consumption, and these platforms as well have been really key in making labour markets more precarious, moving towards zero contract hours, underemployment, and things like that. Whenever you hear the words around things like Uber and the likes, that they're kind of coming into spaces to destroy them in a way, to revolutionize and disrupt is the word I'm looking for. Disruption in that sense, often rather than creating efficiencies for the consumer, which they do in many ways, seem to really have detrimental effects to the workforce in those spaces. Uber being a primary example here, where the people that use the platform are largely treated not as workers but as contractors, and therefore lose many of the kind of labour rights that's been fought for over previous centuries. Now again, what happens there is there's now political contestations over that. In some cities now, Uber needs to make the workers direct employers. In others they haven't, but largely this has had real detrimental effects to labour and work relations, and particularly as it becomes more and more the norm and other industries try and introduce versions of that kind of distance between the employer and the employee. So we increasingly rely on these platforms too in day-to-day life. Many people now make their living on them. We communicate through them. We get most of our information on them. So again, the term I've been using a lot about this is ambivalence. Phillips and Milner have called this the ambivalent internet, and they've also got a good book about trolling called This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things. And they talk about how there's both oddities, absurdism, mischief, antagonisms that are going on in these spaces that have become the kind of mundane forms of everyday communication. They become ways that we identify ourselves and the way we identify others. And they certainly have had profound effects on the way that politics happens. This weird and wonderful world is kind of a brave new world that's both institutional, generative and destructive all at once. So again, you can see the ambivalence there. They write about trolling, for instance, as an example. It's both obscene and offensive, but it isn't kind of necessarily a totally new thing. It's one of the affordances of this new technology, but it kind of becomes what they call a grotesque pantomime of dominant norms. The way that trolling works, more often than not, seems to reinforce and reproduce, long-held inequalities, descriptions, like that. Importantly, when thinking about platform capitalism, we need to now understand that one of the things that many of these platforms are competing over is our attention. Our attention itself is now one of the the key products or the key things of capitalism that these companies need to monopolize. There's so much information out there, so much kind of entertainment, so much many platforms, so much social media, that much of the competition that's going on now is to actually get us to pay attention to them and practice on them. So, our attention therefore becomes data, because once we get on these platforms, we're clicking and sharing and liking and producing in forms of prosumption, and this is the very stuff that keeps these things going. So our world is really full of information, images, symbols, communication, distractions, all this stuff's going on. So that before we can actually be drawn into buying something, it's our attention that needs to be hailed first, or even before we can be drawn into kind of being on the platform, our attention needs to be drawn to it. So this is what's been called for, centuries of analysis really about the economy of attention, and this goes back, to the 1800s, things like street advertising, billboards. These are things that compete for our attention to kind of draw our attention to things and inform us to maybe buy them or participate in them. But Sitton kind of says, this new layer of digital attention seeking means we need to think beyond that, and particularly about the ways that the blurriness between the IRL and the online happens here. So, the way that kind of ads and books and search engines and art and all these things kind of are in the same realm. So our attention in this sense is a key product of capitalism. One of the things we're kind of realizing about our attention, though, is that these platforms can sometimes produce what's been known as filter bubbles. Now, the idea of filter bubble is like controversial in some senses. It can tend to be overemphasized a little bit, but I think there's certainly like homologies going on in terms of the way that people consume, just like there is in kind of broader taste cultures. So, the data that these platforms collect on us, they, in a way, build up a profile on us, and then kind of, feed back to us the things that the algorithm thinks we may or may not like. And the research here tends to show that what this means is that we become increasingly connected to our in-group. The network, the way that the networks and the nodes are kind of set up in it, and the things that we see tend to be then connected to people we share similarities with, and therefore become more and more isolated from people that we don't share similarities with. And this kind of goes against much of the early kind of understandings of media and the way that would kind of work in globalization, particularly, Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village, that, the more that kind of people in different cultures and countries and places got to kind of see the lives of other people, we would understand them more, like them more probably, and not have all these kind of boundaries and struggles going on between them. It seems that, much of the media development since the 60s when McLuhan was writing is kind of challenges that idea, I suppose. Palliser, in this sense, argues that the technological affordances of this personalisation, this idea that these algorithms can kind of track our online behaviour and then, provide the ads to sell us the stuff that we really want, creates this filter bubble, a self-contained loop of inclusion, which may perpetuate fantasy ideas about the nature of reality and guide our choices. Now, of course, this has also been called echo chambers, and particularly this is around notions of disinformation, fake news, and the likes of that. Importantly, though, these filter bubbles, if they actually exist, they're kind of porous as well, so we're not kind of trapped in them. And I suppose anyone that's kind of seen tailored ads to them, that kind of sometimes they're kind of quite weird and have nothing to do with anything you've ever been interested in before, shows that they don't actually work all that well. In fact, currently Facebook's trying to make me buy my own book, so that's not really great at doing this stuff sometimes, but other times it does. Definitely, I think I've probably bought stuff, because it keeps popping up in my feed. So there's a kind of play off here between how tight that echo chamber filter bubble thing is, and again, sociologists are interested in doing research around how this affects our day-to-day lives, our choices, and the way that we relate to people. Really importantly, though, there's some amazing work going across, the world at the moment around how these kind of the way that algorithms depend on data is inherently discriminating. So there's many really good books on this, and I recommend them all, particularly around the predictive postcode, algorithms of oppression, race after technology, weapons of math destruction, and the book called Discriminating Data. They're excellent reads on this kind of stuff. What they show here is that, there's different ways to build something like an algorithm. You can build kind of racial inequalities in it to consider, so the algorithm tries to consider it, or you can pretend that, racism or something doesn't exist. Either way, these things tend to then replicate racial discriminations anyway, based on both the way that people use them and some of the silly assumptions that are built into them. So again, someone that's not like a technologist or someone that works with data, I find that stuff a little bit difficult to understand myself. Those books are really good introductions to get a grasp of that kind of thing. So examples about this, they're basically every day. I mean, Google's been found to let advertisers use actual racist phrases to target people, to target racists. There's lots of examples. Sometimes they're kind of funny, but like they speak to, wider problems here where face recognition things don't really recognize faces unless they're white. There's a bunch of YouTube videos that show those kind of things. There's even like some examples of the early taps where you kind of run your hand on them, that they only kind of work for white people for a while. Geodemographic analysis is increasingly something that's sprung up around the collection of data, and companies use this, to sell us stuff or whatever, but it's increasingly shown that they're using it to discriminate and to make false assumptions about people, groups, neighbourhoods, suburbs, along racial lines and gender and class. So you can see again how these disruptions and progressions of digital media, much of the tech actually replicates these long-standing inequalities and discrimination. And in the US in particular, but increasingly around the world, in the West in particular again, it's been shown to be using and replicating what's become known as redlining. And that's the actual denial of things like housing, credit, insurance, and healthcare to minority suburbs around this kind of collection of data that's quite discriminating. So again, if you're interested in that, there's some really excellent books. You can look at that kind of thing. Okay, to sum up our week this week on digital sociology and technology, I suppose the main takeout here is that, they're so embedded in our day-to-day lives that they're part of life. Like some media theorists argue now that media is culture. You could really kind of make similar arguments about how digital media, our emergence in these things are culture as well. They're central to how we live, work, play, all those kind of things, and they consistently blur the lines with those things. We're constantly working for free for these companies, providing them with the data they need to continue to sell, to advertise. Sociologists approach these things, I suppose, thinking from them from numerous angles: how they support inequalities, how they provide us with freedoms and affordances, how they mediate our engagement with other people, with institutions, and how they support creativity in some senses, but see that it be kind of co-opted and sold and things like that in others. So there's a plethora of different sociological orientations towards this stuff, and so much really amazing research around the world going on about this. So new studies and concepts emerge to deal with this stuff, with digital culture. But because stuff happens so quickly, it's actually quite difficult to keep up. So it constantly feels like things are in a state of flux, in this kind of state of social change. But as I said, all the kind of new disruptions, new changes seem to constantly reproduce many of the kind of distinct patterns of social inequalities and things like that sociology has been interested in analysing for centuries. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.